What happens when the most powerful one in the room turns out to be the most wrong? We are taught from the very beginning that strength leads, that the one who is fastest, fiercest, most willing to push forward and take up space is the one the group follows. It is one of the oldest assumptions baked into the way we understand power, that force earns authority, that dominance is its own justification, that when someone strong enough arrives and claims the front of the line, the natural response of everyone around them is to step aside and let them lead. But what if that assumption has always been incomplete? What if there is a layer to the way groups actually work, animal and human alike, that runs deeper than strength, older than aggression, and more durable than any individual's capacity for force? What if the rules we think govern power are not the real rules at all, but only the visible surface of something far more complex operating underneath? This is a story about a moment when that hidden layer became impossible to ignore. When a new leader arrived among the wolves, stronger than those before him, more aggressive, moving through the pack with the specific confidence of something that has never been told no, and advanced. And the pack, instead of falling in line behind him the way every assumption about animal hierarchy would predict, turned against him. Not the rival, not the challenger from outside. The pack itself, the very group he believed he was leading. Stay with me, because what happened in that moment, and more importantly, why it happened, is going to reframe the way you think about power, loyalty, and the invisible rules that hold groups together, even when no one is consciously enforcing them. There is something deeply unsettling about watching strength fail. Not because it was overpowered by greater strength, that we understand, that fits the model. What unsettles us is when strength fails because the group simply refuses to recognize it. When the most physically capable individual in a system turns out to have fundamentally misread what the system actually runs on. When force arrives at the center of a structure and discovers that the structure was never built to accommodate it in the first place. Have you ever witnessed something like that? In a workplace, in a family, in any group you have been part of, the moment when someone who had every apparent advantage moved forward with total confidence, and something stopped them that had nothing to do with a stronger opponent. Something more like a collective withdrawal. A silent, distributed decision made by the group without a meeting or a vote that this particular kind of leadership was not what was going to be followed here. That moment, when it happens, is always more significant than it looks on the surface. It is revealing something about the group's actual values, about the real criteria by which it decides who deserves to be at its center. Criteria that are usually invisible until someone violates them completely enough to make them suddenly, undeniably visible. What you are about to discover is that the wolf pack's response to this new leader was not a malfunction. It was not chaos, not confusion, not an exception to the rules of how these animals operate. It was the rules, the deep rules, the ones that exist underneath the visible hierarchy and that the visible hierarchy exists to serve. And understanding those rules changes everything, not just about wolves, but about every group you have ever been part of, and every question you have ever had about why real leadership looks so different from what power alone would predict. That is exactly where we are going next. And the reason this matters so much, the reason it reaches beyond the fascinating specifics of animal behavior into something that touches every human life, is that most of us have been operating inside systems our whole lives without ever being shown. The real rules. We were taught the visible rules, the ones about hierarchy and performance, and the kind of strength that announces itself. We were graded, evaluated, promoted, or passed over, according to metrics that measured the surface layer of things. And most of us, at some point, felt the gap between those metrics and something deeper, some quality of leadership or belonging or trust that the official system could not quite account for, that the visible rules could not quite explain. The wolf pack was not confused that day. It was not malfunctioning. It was operating according to a wisdom that runs so deep in the structure of how social animals, including humans, actually hold together that it does not need to be articulated or enforced. It simply is. And when something violates it clearly enough, the response is not debate or deliberation. It is the clean, collective, almost instinctive withdrawal of recognition. The group does not fight the false leader. It simply stops, following. And in a system where leadership only exists through the consent of those being led, the withdrawal of that consent is the most complete kind of power available. This idea that the deepest authority in any group is not held by the strongest individual, but distributed across the whole, is one of those truths that seems obvious once you hear it, and yet somehow never quite made it into the frameworks most of us were given for understanding how power works. And that gap between what we were taught and what is actually true is one of the things this channel exists to close. If something in what you just heard is resonating, if it is touching a question you have carried about leadership, about belonging, about the moments when force and genuine authority turned out to be completely different things, I want to hear about it. Go to the comments right now and tell me, have you ever been in a group that turned against someone who had all the apparent power? Or have you ever watched someone lead without any obvious force, simply through something the group recognized and trusted, and found yourself wondering what exactly that something was? Your experience in that space is not separate from this conversation. It is the conversation. The comments here are where this content becomes a real exchange rather than a one-way delivery. And that exchange is what gives this kind of storytelling its full life. If this is landing as something real and valuable for you, if you came here for surface-level content and found something that asked more of you than that, then a like is your way of saying, more of this. It takes 1 second, and it matters more than it might seem, because it is the signal that tells the platform this kind of depth deserves a wider audience. One tap from you reaches someone else who needed exactly this and hadn't found it yet. And if you are not yet part of this community, subscribe now. This channel is built for exactly the kind of person who gets to this point in a video and realizes they want to keep going, who wants the questions underneath the questions, the layer beneath the visible layer, the real rules rather than the ones posted on the wall. If that is you, you belong here. Hit subscribe and stay close, because what is coming next builds directly on everything we have just opened up. Your presence here is what makes it possible to go deeper, and we are about to go much deeper. To understand what made that moment so extraordinary, to really sit with the full weight of what happened when the pack turned, you first have to understand what a wolf pack actually is. Not the simplified version, not the outdated model that dominated popular understanding for decades, and that most people still carry around as their default picture of how these animals organize themselves. The real version. The one that researchers who have spent years in the field watching actual wolves in actual conditions have spent the last several decades carefully, painstakingly assembling from direct observation. The old model was clean and satisfying in the way that simple models always are. There is an alpha at the top, the strongest, the most aggressive, the one who fought his way to dominance and holds that position through the ongoing credible threat of force. Below him, a hierarchy descends in order of power, each animal knowing its place, each relationship defined by who can dominate whom. The whole structure is maintained by regular displays of submission and dominance, by the constant low-level assertion and reassertion of rank, by a system in which physical superiority is the currency of authority and the exchange rate never changes. This model felt true because it matched something in the way humans have long understood power. It confirmed the intuition, or perhaps the fear, that at the bottom of every social structure, beneath all the civilized overlay, the real organizing principle is force. That if you stripped everything else away, what remained was a simple dominance hierarchy, and that the animals who had not developed the civilized overlay to complicate things were showing us the truth about ourselves in its purest form. The problem is that it was wrong. Not partially wrong, not wrong in some details while correct in its broad strokes. Fundamentally, structurally wrong. Wrong about what wolf packs actually are, wrong about how they actually function, and wrong in ways that matter enormously to understanding what happened that day when the new leader advanced and the pack refused to follow. The research that dismantled the old model emerged from a shift in methodology. The original dominance hierarchy studies were conducted on captive wolves, animals from different family groups, thrown together in an artificial environment, forced to compete for limited resources in a space that had none of the features of natural wolf territory. Of course, those animals formed rigid dominance hierarchies. They were strangers to each other, stressed in an unnatural situation that rewarded aggression and punished cooperation. The hierarchy that emerged was a product of the conditions, not a revelation of wolf nature. When researchers began studying wolves in the wild, following actual family groups across their actual territories over extended periods, what they found was something entirely different. Wolf packs, in their natural state, are not dominance hierarchies. Maintained by force, they are families. The animals at the center of the group, the ones most researchers had been calling the alpha male and alpha female, are typically the breeding pair, the parents. Their authority in the group does not come from fighting. It comes from the same place that parental authority comes from in any family: experience, investment, responsibility, and a relationship with the group that runs deeper than any single encounter. The so-called alpha wolves lead not by dominating, but by knowing. They know the territory, where the prey moves at different times of year, where the water sources are, where the boundaries of neighboring packs run, and how much pressure those boundaries can take before a conflict becomes unavoidable. They know the history, what worked last winter, what nearly got the pack killed 2 years ago, which strategies are reliable and which are situational. They know the individuals in their group, which wolves are ready for more. Responsibility, which are still developing, where the tensions are and how to manage them before they become fractures. This knowledge, accumulated over years of shared life in shared territory, is the real source of leadership in a wolf pack. It is not performed through displays of dominance. It is demonstrated through decisions that keep the group alive, fed, and functional across seasons and years. The pack follows these leaders not because it is afraid of them, but because it has learned, through direct experience, that following their judgment produces better outcomes than not following it. The authority is earned and continuously re-earned through competence. It is, in the deepest sense, consensual. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because this is where the story of the new leader and what the pack did when he arrived begins to make a different kind of sense. When a wolf with the behavioral profile of the animal in this story enters a functioning pack, what he is encountering is not a simple dominance hierarchy that he can take over by defeating the current top dog. He is encountering a complex social organism with deep internal relationships, shared history, distributed competence, and an underlying logic that has nothing to do with who can win a fight. He is bringing the wrong tool to a lock it was not designed to open. His strength is real, his aggression is real, his capacity to physically dominate other individuals in the group is real, but none of that translates into the kind of authority the pack actually runs on, because that authority is not stored in physical capacity. It is stored in relationship, in trust, in the accumulated evidence of competent care over time. The new leader arrived with everything the old model said leadership required. He was larger than the existing dominant male, observably, significantly larger, in the way that registers immediately and unavoidably in the nervous systems of every animal nearby. He was aggressive with a specific quality of aggression that was different from the ordinary jostling and posturing of pack social life. It was colder than that, more absolute. The aggression of something that was not performing dominance as a social ritual, but expressing it as a fundamental orientation toward everything around it. An aggression that did not negotiate, did not read the room, did not adjust its intensity in response to the signals of the animals it was directed at. He moved through the pack's social space the way a force of nature moves, without reference to the existing structure, without acknowledgement of the relationships and understandings that gave the space its organization. He did not work his way into the group's trust. He did not demonstrate competence in ways the pack could observe and evaluate. He simply asserted, through the physical reality of his presence and the unmistakable quality of his intention, that he was now the center around which things would organize, that the previous arrangement was over and the new arrangement was him. In a captive study, in an artificial environment, in the simplified conditions that produced the flawed dominance hierarchy model, this approach might have worked. The stressed, displaced animals of those studies responded to force because force was the most reliable available signal in an environment stripped of the richer social information that wild wolves use to navigate their relationships. In that environment, the biggest and most aggressive animal did tend to end up at the top because the environment had removed everything else that might have competed with size and aggression as a basis for authority. But this was not that environment. This was a functioning family group operating in territory they had known for years, governed by the invisible but enormously powerful architecture of their actual relationships. And in that environment, the new leader's approach was not just ineffective. It was illegible. It did not speak the language the pack's social system was built to receive. It was broadcasting on a frequency that the group's deepest organizational principles did not have a receiver for. The tension this created in the pack was visible to anyone watching closely enough, not the tension of animals preparing for a dominance challenge, not the specific familiar quality of a group reorganizing itself around a new center of force, a different kind of tension. The tension of a system encountering something that does not fit its categories. That quality of collective unease that moves through a group when the social logic it runs on is being violated in ways it can feel but not yet articulate. The wolves were restless in ways that were not their normal restlessness. Their social interactions had a slightly off quality, the rhythms slightly wrong, the usual flow of information between them slightly disrupted, as if a frequency they all relied on was experiencing interference. They were not afraid of the new leader in the way that fear normally moves through a pack, generating submission responses in some and careful distance in others. They were disturbed by him in a way that is harder to name, disturbed in the specific way of animals whose social world has been disrupted at a level they cannot resolve through the ordinary mechanisms available to them. And then came the child. She arrived in the pack's territory in the way that children sometimes arrive in places they should not be. Not with dramatic intention, not with the focused purpose of someone pursuing a plan, but with the incremental drift of a small person following interest and curiosity through terrain that had gradually shifted from familiar to something else without any single moment of obvious transition. One step after another, each one reasonable given the last, until the accumulated steps had produced a location that none of them individually would have predicted or chosen. She was young enough that the full weight of her situation did not register with the precision it would have in an older person. She understood, in the body-level way of children who have grown up with adults who respected the natural world enough to teach its dangers, that she was somewhere she should not be. But the understanding was not yet the sharp, adrenaline-soaked clarity of someone in conscious fear. It was something softer than that, a quality of heightened attention, of increased awareness, the particular alertness of a child who has noticed that the world around her has changed register without being certain yet of what that change means. She stopped moving when she saw them. This was instinct operating correctly. The freeze response that the body produces when it has registered a threat before the mind has fully processed it. She was still, and in her stillness she was, paradoxically, more present to the moment than she would have been in flight, more available to whatever information the situation contained, more capable of reading the subtle signals that movement would have obscured. The pack saw her. Of course they saw her. Wolf perception is not human perception, and a motionless child in open terrain was not invisible to animals whose sensory apparatus was built around exactly this kind of awareness. They registered her presence with the specific quality of attention that predators give to potential prey, the focused, assessing quality of organisms that have been shaped by evolution to evaluate exactly this kind of situation in exactly this kind of moment. But the assessment, in this case, did not proceed to its expected conclusion. Something in the pack's response to the child had a quality that was different from the standard predator-prey calculus, not the absence of attention. The attention was fully present, but the attention had something in it that was not hunger, not aggression, not the building. Momentum of a group preparing to hunt. Something that the people who later tried to describe what they had witnessed would reach for words like recognition to approximate, though recognition is a human concept, and what was happening here was something that operated below the level of concept, in the body-level intelligence of animals making assessments that go deeper than conscious deliberation. The new leader felt none of this complexity. Or rather, he felt it and did not know what to do with it because his entire orientation toward the world was built around a framework in which complexity of this kind was irrelevant. He operated on the simple, powerful logic of force and hierarchy, and in that logic, a small, vulnerable, motionless prey animal in the middle of pack territory had a straightforward meaning. He advanced. The advance was not tentative. It was not the careful, information-gathering approach of an experienced predator who knows that situations are often more complex than they appear and that patience tends to produce better outcomes than immediacy. It was direct, confident, and absolute, the advance of something that had never been given a reason to doubt that its intentions would become outcomes. He moved toward the child with the specific quality of inevitability that his whole approach to the world was built around. The message in his movement was not ambiguous. It was the clearest possible statement of what he was and what he intended. The pack watched him advance. And here is where the transformation that had been building in them, the slow accumulation of tension and wrongness and illegibility that had been generating since his arrival, found its moment of crystallization. Because watching him advance toward that child, watching the force and the absolute confidence and the complete indifference to everything around him that characterized his approach, something in the pack reached a threshold it had been approaching without anyone quite knowing the threshold was there. The hesitation that followed was not planned. It was not the result of deliberation or discussion or any process of collective decision-making that could be traced through visible behavior. It was more fundamental than any of that. More like the hesitation of a body that has been told to do something by the conscious mind, but finds that the deeper levels of the organism are not willing to comply. The pack did not move. The energy that should have built into forward motion, the collective momentum of a group following its leader into a hunt, did not build. The circuit was open somewhere. The current was not flowing. What happened in that pause is one of the most interesting things in this entire story, and it deserves to be examined carefully because it contains a truth about group behavior that most frameworks for understanding social dynamics either miss entirely or significantly underestimate. The pause was not the absence of a response. It was a response. A collective, distributed, simultaneous response that did not require coordination because it was not emerging from individual decisions that needed to be aligned. It was emerging from something that already existed in the shared space between these animals, something built from years of life together, shared experience, mutual knowledge, and the specific kind of trust that develops in a group that has faced real challenges and learned, over time, what actually keeps them alive. That thing, that shared foundation, that invisible architecture of genuine relationship, was what the new leader had been unable to reach or damage or incorporate since his arrival. And in this moment, it was what made the pack's response possible. Not a decision to resist him, not a calculation of costs and benefits, a recognition, arriving simultaneously in multiple bodies, that what he was doing was wrong in a way that was prior to any specific rule or prohibition. Wrong in the way that certain things are wrong before anyone has articulated why. Wrong in the body, in the nervous system, in the deep social intelligence of animals whose survival has always depended on their capacity to maintain the bonds that make collective life possible. The child was part of that recognition, not because the wolves had a concept of her innocence or her vulnerability in human terms, but because something about her presence in the world, the specific quality of her stillness, her smallness, the particular frequency of her fear, was something the pack's deep intelligence received and responded to in a way that bypassed the usual categories of threat assessment. She was not registering as prey in the systems that mattered. She was registering as something else, something that the pack's oldest and deepest social programming recognized as warranting a response that had nothing to do with dominance or hunger or the territorial logic of apex predators. The rupture, when it came, was swift in the way that things are swift when they have been building for a long time and finally find their release. The wolves moved, but not toward the child, and not in the forward momentum of a pack following its leader. They moved against him. Not in the organized, strategic way of animals executing a plan, in the immediate, certain way of a system correcting itself, of a group that has identified a source of damage and is removing it the way a body removes something that does not belong. It was not a traditional dominance challenge. Anyone watching who expected that kind of structured encounter, the posturing, the escalating displays, the ritualized combat that wolf social life uses to resolve hierarchy questions, would have been disoriented by what they saw instead. There was no ritual. There was no negotiation, no gradual escalation of signals, no formal assertion of the kind of dominance that could be met with submission and resolved without full conflict. The pack's response was not trying to establish a new hierarchy. It was trying to remove something that the hierarchy as they actually lived it could not accommodate. Something that was not playing by the real rules and showed no capacity to learn them. He was blocked, not by a single challenger, by the group, by the combined weight of bodies that had placed themselves between him and the direction he had been moving, not in the posture of fighters, but in the posture of something more definitive, refusal. The specific, collective, immovable refusal of a social organism that has reached the limit of what it will accommodate. He was large, and he was strong, and in a one-on-one encounter, he would likely have prevailed against any individual in the pack. But that was not what he was facing. He was facing the group as a unit, and the group as a unit was not operating on the logic of individual strength. It was operating on something else entirely. The confusion that moved through him in those moments was visible in his behavior in the way that confusion is always visible in animals, in the disruption of the confident, linear quality that had characterized everything he did up to that point. His advance had been absolute. His certainty had been total. And now he was encountering something that his entire framework for understanding his situation had not prepared him for. Resistance that did not come from a stronger individual. Resistance that came from a collective decision that he was not the right kind of thing to be at the center of this group. The silence that settled over the scene after the initial rupture was the silence that follows a fundamental shift. Not the silence of things being over, but the silence of things having changed in a way that has not yet been fully absorbed. The new leader had stopped moving. The pack held its position between him and the child, and in that held moment, something that had been invisible throughout the entire sequence of events became, for anyone watching carefully enough to feel it, almost palpable. The child was the still point, not the cause of the confrontation in any transactional sense. She had not done anything, had not intervened, had not been the agent of anything that had happened. But she was the occasion, the presence around which the pack's deepest nature had organized itself when it was required to. And there was something in the quality of the space around her, in the specific character of the stillness that had settled there, that was different from the ordinary stillness of a frightened child waiting to discover what happened next. It was quieter than fear, more settled than waiting. It had the quality of something that had never been in genuine danger in the way the situation appeared to suggest, because the situation had other dimensions that were not visible to a casual observer. The new leader did not understand what he was looking at. He did not understand the child, did not understand the pack's response to her, did not understand what the group had just demonstrated about the nature of the authority he had claimed. He understood force, and the force he had brought was real, and it had failed to produce the outcome that force, in his experience, always produced. This created in him something that force-based systems always produce when they encounter genuine limits. Not insight, not recalibration, but a kind of arrested bewilderment. The specific condition of something that has run into a wall it did not know existed and has not yet begun the process of understanding what the wall is made of. He backed away. Not in submission, the behavioral vocabulary of submission was available to him, and he did not use it, which itself was significant, another data point in the pack's ongoing assessment of what he was. He backed away in the way that something retreats when the forward path has become unavailable without any alternative path yet presenting itself. A pure withdrawal, unaccompanied by any of the social signals that would have given it meaning in the pack's relational language. He simply stopped advancing and reversed, and the reversal communicated nothing except the absence of forward motion. Now I want to go even deeper into what this moment reveals, because the surface of the event, extraordinary as it was, is not where the most significant truth lives. The pack's action that day was not, at its core, about the new leader. It was not primarily a story about his failure or his removal or the correction of a hierarchical error. It was a story about what the pack actually was, about the nature of the bonds that held it together and the depth of the values those bonds encoded. The pack turned against the new leader not because he was weak, not because a stronger challenger had emerged, not because the existing hierarchy had been successfully defended by its previous occupants. The pack turned against him because what he intended to do violated something at the center of what the pack understood itself to be. This is the revelation that changes the meaning of everything that came before it. Wolf packs, actual wolf packs, functioning in the wild as families with histories and relationships and accumulated shared knowledge, are not simply survival machines running on dominant software. They are communities. And communities, in the deepest sense, are defined not by who is strongest within them, but by what they collectively refuse to allow. By the things that are so fundamental to the group's understanding of itself, that their violation produces not just resistance, but something closer to the immune response of a living organism, automatic, immediate, not dependent on conscious deliberation, because it is operating at a level below the deliberation-requiring layer. What the pack refused to allow that day was the destruction of something vulnerable that had entered their space. And the refusal was not a policy, not a rule, not a decision that had been made and stored somewhere for application in relevant circumstances. It was a value, lived, embodied, distributed across the entire group in the form of a shared orientation that did not need to be articulated because it was simply part of what these animals were to each other and to their world. The new leader's fundamental error, the error that made his approach to the pack not just unsuccessful but impossible, was his assumption that the group was a resource to be captured rather than a relationship to be earned. He treated the pack the way you treat a territory, something to be claimed through sufficient demonstration of dominance, after which the claiming would be permanent and the territory would simply be yours. He did not understand, because his entire experience of the world had not required him to understand, that the thing he wanted was not the kind of thing that could be claimed this way. That leadership in a real social group is not a position you occupy but a relationship you inhabit. And relationships cannot be seized, they can only be grown. The transformation that occurs in an observer who fully absorbs this distinction is not a small one. Because most of us live inside systems, organizations, families, communities, societies that still operate, at least in their official theory of themselves, on some version of the old model. The model that says authority flows from power, that the person or entity with the greatest capacity for force is the natural center of the hierarchy, that the appropriate response to strength is compliance, and the appropriate response to weakness is dismissal. We have built enormously complex social structures on top of this foundation, and those structures have generated incredible things: civilization, technology, art, science, all of it. But the foundation is flawed in the specific way that all foundations are flawed when they mistake a partial truth for the whole truth. The partial truth is real, strength matters, capacity matters. The ability to do what needs to be done in the moments that require it matters enormously. A pack without strong hunters does not survive. A community without people capable of decisive action in crisis is vulnerable in ways that gentleness alone cannot address. The old model was not wrong about the importance of capacity. It was wrong about the relationship between capacity and authority. It conflated them, treated authority as if it were simply accumulated capacity, as if the right to lead were a direct function of the ability to overpower. And that conflation, however intuitive it feels, produces exactly the kind of leader the pack turned against. Someone for whom the capability is real, but the authority is not. The hidden truth, the one that the pack's behavior that day was demonstrating without any intention of demonstrating anything, is that genuine authority in a social group is always and only a gift from the group. It is not taken, it is extended. It is extended to those whom the group has experienced as trustworthy with its well-being, as competent custodians of the shared life, as individuals whose judgment, when followed, tends to produce outcomes that serve the whole rather than just the individual doing the judging. And it is withdrawn, quietly, collectively, without drama or formal announcement, when the evidence accumulates that the person holding it is not oriented toward the group's well-being, but toward their own power. This withdrawal is not a revolution. It does not require a challenger. It does not need an opposing force to set it in motion. It simply happens in the way that a consensus dissolves when the shared understanding that supported it is no longer shared. The new leader had never held the pack's genuine authority because he had never done anything to earn it. He had held a kind of surface compliance, the behavioral adjustments that animals make in the short term, when facing something they cannot immediately resolve. But surface compliance and genuine followership are not the same thing, and anyone observing carefully enough could have seen the difference from the beginning. The pack had been telling him, in every interaction since his arrival, that he was not the center he believed himself to be. He had not been listening, because his framework did not include the possibility of an authority he could not simply take. The child's presence had accelerated something that was already in motion. She had provided the specific circumstance, the absolute, non-negotiable test case that made the gap between his claimed authority and his actual standing in the group impossible to paper over any longer. He had moved toward something that the pack's deepest values protected, and the movement had forced a resolution that months of lower-stakes friction had not been able to produce. In this sense, she was not incidental to the story. She was the occasion for its decisive moment, the specific gravity around which the latent energy of the pack's real relationships crystallized into action. And this is the part of the story that most people who hear it focus on last, because it is the most uncomfortable part. Not the wolf's failure, not the pack's turning, not even the child's miraculous non-harm. The most uncomfortable part is the question of what the new leader represented. What the qualities that made him dangerous in this context say about the kinds of leadership that human communities install in positions of authority, and why those communities sometimes respond to such leaders with the same combination of surface compliance and deep, distributed, quietly building resistance that the pack demonstrated in the weeks before the day of the confrontation. Because the new leader is not a rare phenomenon. He is recognizable. He is the person in the organization who rose through a specific environment that rewarded the qualities he had, perhaps a period of crisis that favored decisiveness over wisdom, or a selection process that measured confidence over competence, or a culture that had confused aggression with strength for long enough that the distinction had become invisible. He arrived in the position carrying all the qualities that the selection process valued and none of the ones that actual sustained leadership requires. And he led the way you lead when you do not understand that leadership is a relationship, by asserting, demanding, moving forward without reading the room, treating the resistance of the people around him as an obstacle to be overcome rather than information to be processed. The groups that produce this kind of leader are not failures. They are groups whose internal measurement systems have become miscalibrated. Groups that have, over time, started selecting for visible strength because the tools for measuring deeper forms of competence have degraded or been discarded. And the repair, when it comes, rarely comes through the official channels that produced the problem. It comes the way the pack's correction came, from the living tissue of actual relationships, from the values that persist in the social body, even when the formal structures have stopped reflecting them, from the collective intelligence that distributes itself across a whole community and waits, sometimes for a very long time, for the moment when it can act. The bando that remained after the new leaders. Withdrawal was not the same group it had been before his arrival, not because of what they had lost, nothing essential had been lost, but because of what the confrontation had revealed to them about themselves. They had discovered something about the depth of their own coherence, about the solidity of the foundation that their years of shared life had built, about the specific character of the values that lived in them collectively, the ones that had remained intact through the disruption, that had actually been clarified by the confrontation, that now had a visible shape they had not had before because they had never been tested so directly. The child was unharmed. This was not a coincidence, not an accident of timing, not the result of any single intervention by any single actor in the situation. It was the outcome of a system functioning correctly, of a community's deep values generating the response those values required at the moment they were most needed. She had been protected not by a designated protector, not by a planned response to a known threat. She had been protected by the character of the group itself, by what the group was at its core, expressed in action at the moment of maximum test. The strangest thing about that day, the detail that sat in everyone who witnessed it and continued to ask questions for years afterward, was not the new leader's failure. Failures of aggressive, force-based authority are not, on reflection, surprising. The history of social groups is full of them. What was strange, what was genuinely difficult to account for in any framework that limited itself to the visible, was the quality of the space around the child in the period between when the threat became real and when the pack moved. The specific, settled, absolutely calm quality of that space, as if something had already decided the outcome, as if the protection was not a response to the threat, but a prior condition that the threat had simply not yet bumped up against. The most experienced observer present that day, someone who had spent more time watching wolves in the wild than almost anyone of their generation, said something later that has stayed with everyone who heard it. They said, "In all the years I have watched these animals, I have never seen a pack move the way that pack moved. Not toward a challenger, not in the pattern of a dominance correction, not in any configuration I have a category for. They moved as if they were not making a decision, but fulfilling one, as if the decision had already been made somewhere they could all access, but none of them had made. That description, fulfilling a decision that had already been made somewhere they could all access, but none of them had made, is as close as human language gets to pointing at what was actually happening. It points at the level of group coherence where individual decision-making ends and something more collective begins, where the boundaries between individuals become permeable enough that the group's orientation becomes something that lives in every member simultaneously without requiring transmission, where the values that the group embodies are not stored in any single location but distributed across the whole, available to every part of it, generating consistent responses to consistent violations without any central coordination. This is what the new leader had been unable to read, unable to access, unable to incorporate or overpower or work around. Not a stronger individual, not a more aggressive rival, something that had no individual location and therefore could not be defeated through the logic of individual combat. The group as a living thing, acting from its own deepest nature in defense of what that nature required. And the child, sitting still in the middle of all that invisible architecture, had simply been inside it. Had been perhaps the reason it was fully present and fully activated in that place at that time. Had been, in the specific and non-metaphorical sense, exactly where she was supposed to be. Write in the comments, the real rules run deeper. Because what you just heard is not only about wolves, and somewhere in you, you already know that. If you stayed all the way to this point, then something in this story recognized you. Not the wolf, not the pack, not even the child. Something in the deeper current running underneath all of it. The part about what real authority actually is. The part about what groups protect when they are functioning at their best. The part about the invisible rules that turn out to be the only rules that ever really mattered. That is the kind of territory this channel lives in. Not the surface of things, but the structure underneath the surface. Not the story everyone already knows, but the layer beneath it that changes what the story means. If that is the conversation you want to keep having, if you arrived here looking for something with more depth than what most content offers and found it, then subscribe. Make it official. Turn on the notifications and be here the next time something like this lands, because the next one builds on exactly what we just uncovered together. Before you go, drop something in the comments. Just this phrase, "I understand the real rules now." That is your signal that you were here, that this reached you at the level it was intended to reach, and it becomes a marker for everyone else who scrolls through and needs to know that other people are thinking at this depth too. Your words in that comment section matter more than you might think, and if this video moved through you, if it shifted something in the way you see leadership or loyalty or the invisible things that hold groups together, then a like is simply your quiet acknowledgement of that shift. One tap. Nothing more required. There is a video right beside this one that takes everything we just explored and carries it into territory you are not expecting. The thread continues there and it goes somewhere that will make this one land even deeper in retrospect. Click on it and come with me. The best part of this conversation is still ahead.